Friendsify you want to watch super hit movie Jeremiah Johnson in English, then you must like this video. If you are visiting our channel for the first time, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. West Films Friends. In today's video, the movie we're going to talk about is called Jeremiah Johnson. We will talk about what this movie is and where you can watch all the interesting facts about this movie in today's video. I'm going to tell you, I am also going to give you all the information on which OTT platform or on which satellite channel you will get to watch this movie. Also, we will talk in detail about the technical department, music department, pre-production, filming, post-production, budget, box office collection of this film. We will also talk about the story of this film, and I will also give you a small review of the story of this film. Apart from this, we will discuss about the facts of this film's storylines, star cast, actors' performance in the film, and which character has played which role. That's why I request you friends to watch this video till the end. So let's start the video. Jeremiah Johnson is a 1972 American West film directed by Sidney Pollack and starring Robert Redford as the title character and Will Geer's bear claw, Chris Lapp. It is based partly on the life of the legendary mountain man John Jeremiah Johnson, recounted in Raymond Thorp and Robert Bunker's book Crow Killer, the saga of liver-eating Johnson, and Vardis Fisher's 1965 novel Mountain Man. The script was written by John Milius and Edward Anhalt. The film was shot at various locations in Redford's adopted home state of Utah. It was entered into the 1972 Cannes Film Festival on May 7, 1972, and was later released on December 21, 1972 by Warner Bros. Pictures. The film received very positive reviews from critics and was a box office success, earning $44.7 million against a budget of $3.1 million, making it the sixth highest grossing film of 1972. Plot: Mexican War veteran Jeremiah Johnson takes up the life of a mountain man, supporting himself in the Rocky Mountains as a trapper. His first winter in mountain country is difficult, and he has a run-in with Paints His Shirt Red, a chief of the Crow tribe. He starts out with a .30 caliber Hawken percussion rifle, which he uses as his main rifle until he finds the frozen body of mountain man Hatchet Jack, clutching a .50 caliber Hawken rifle. Jack's will gives his rifle to the man who finds his corpse. With his new rifle, Johnson inadvertently disrupts the grizzly bear hunt of the elderly and eccentric Chris Lapp, nicknamed Bear Claw, who mentors him on living in the high country. After a brush with crows, including Lapp's acquaintance Paints His Shirt Red, and learning the skills required to survive, Johnson sets off on his own. He comes across a cabin whose inhabitants were apparently attacked by Blackfoot warriors, leaving only a woman and her uncommunicative son alive. The woman, maddened by grief, forces Johnson to adopt her son. He and the boy, whom Johnson dubs Caleb, come across Delguay, a mountain man who has been robbed by the Blackfeet and buried by them up to his neck in sand. Geer persuades Johnson to help recover his stolen goods. Johnson counsels against violence when they find the Blackfoot camp. The men sneak into the camp at night to retrieve Gay's possessions, but Geer opens fire and the mountain men then kill the Blackfeet. Geer takes several Blackfoot horses and scalps. Johnson, disgusted with the needless killing, returns to Caleb. Soon afterward, they are surprised by Christianized flatheads, who take them in as guests of honor. Johnson unknowingly places the chief in his debt by giving him the Blackfeet horses and scalps. According to flathead custom, to maintain his honor, the chief must now either give his guest a greater gift or kill him. The chief gives his daughter Swan to be Johnson's bride. After the wedding, Guay goes off on his own, and Johnson, Caleb, and Swan journey into the wilderness. Johnson finds a suitable location to build a cabin. They settle into this new home and slowly become a family. This idyllic life is interrupted by the arrival of a U.S. Army cavalry rescue party tasked with saving a stranded wagon train of settlers. Although Johnson is reluctant, he is pressed into guiding the rescue party through the mountains, leaving his family alone at their cabin. During the journey, Lieutenant Mulvey orders the party to proceed directly through a sacred Crow burial ground against Johnson's advice. Afterward, Johnson returns home by the same route and notices that the graves are now adorned with Swan's blue trinkets. He rushes back to the cabin, where he finds both Swan and Caleb have been killed. Johnson sets off after the warriors who killed his family and attacks them, killing all but one, a heavy-set man who sings his death song when he realizes he cannot escape. Johnson leaves him alive, and the survivor spreads the tale of the mountain man's quest for revenge throughout the region, trapping Johnson in a feud with the Crow. The tribe sends its best warriors one at a time to kill Johnson, but he defeats each one. His legend grows, and the Crow come to respect him. He meets Gway again and returns to the cabin of Caleb's mother, only to find that she has died and a new settler named Allyn and his family are living there. Nearby, the Crow have built a monument to Johnson's bravery, periodically leaving trinkets and talismans as tribute. Johnson and Lapp meet for a final time. It is at this poignant meeting between student and teacher that Lapp realizes the heavy toll that fighting an entire nation alone in a vast and lonesome frontier has taken on Johnson. Lapp indicates as much when he remarks that Johnson has come far, to which Johnson replies, "Feels like far." Lapp then queries, "Were it worth the trouble?" "What trouble?" Johnson replies. Johnson later has a wordless encounter with Paints his shirt red, presumed to be behind the attacks. While sitting astride their horses far apart, Johnson reaches for his rifle, but Paints his shirt red raises his arm, open-palmed, in a gesture of peace that Johnson slowly returns, signaling an end to their conflict. The film ends with the song lyrics, "And some folks say he's up there still." Cast: Robert Redford as Jeremiah Johnson, Will Geer as Bearclaw, Chris Lapp, Stefan Gierasch as Del Gway, Della Bolton as Swan, Josh Albee as Caleb, Joaquin Martinez as Paints his shirt red, Allyn Ann McLerie as the Crazy Woman, Paul Benedict as Reverend Lindquist, Jack Colvin as Lieutenant Mulvey, Matt Clark as Allyn, Richard Angarola as Chief Two Tongues LeBeau, Charles Tyner as Robadoo, Tanya Tucker as Allyn's daughter, uncredited. Production. Development. In April 1968, producer Sidney Beckerman acquired the film rights to the biographical book Crow Killer, the saga of liver-eating Johnson by Raymond W. Thorp Jr. and Robert Bunker. By May 1970, the rights were acquired by Warner Bros., who assigned John Milius to write a screen adaptation, based roughly on Crow Killer as well as Mountain Man, a novel of male and female in the early American West by Vardis Fisher. Milius first scripted what would become known as Jeremiah Johnson for $5,000, equivalent to $40,000 in 2024. However, he was then hired to rewrite it several times and eventually earned $80,000, equivalent to $650,000 in 2024. According to Milius, Edward Anhalt and David Rayfield were brought in to work on the screenplay only for Milius to be continually rehired because no one else could do the dialogue. Milius says he got the idiom and American spirit from Carl Sandburg and was also influenced by Charles Portis's novel True Grit. The role of Jeremiah Johnson was originally intended for Lee Marvin and then Clint Eastwood, with Sam Peckinpah to direct. However, Peckinpah and Eastwood did not get along, so Peckinpah left and Eastwood decided to make Dirty Harry instead. Warner Brothers then stepped in and set up Milius's screenplay for Robert Redford. Without a director, Redford talked Sidney Pollack into it. The two were looking for another film to collaborate on after This Property is Condemned, 1966. Casting for the role of Swan, Jeremiah's wife, took 3 months. After auditioning for another role, actress Della Bolton was spotted by the casting director, followed up by her participation in the UCLA School of Theater Arts Hugh O'Brien Awards competition. Bolton then interviewed alongside 200 Native American women and eventually won the role, even though she herself was not Native American. Filming. After Warner Bros. Advanced Redford $200,000 to secure him for the film, Warner decided that the film had to be shot on the studio's backlot due to cost constraints. Insisting that it must be shot on location in Utah, Redford and Pollack convinced the studio that this could be done at the same cost. To prepare for production, art director Ted Haworth drove over 26,000 miles to find locations. Ultimately, it was shot in nearly 100 locations across Utah, including Mount Timpanogos, Ashley National Forest, Leeds, Snow Canyon State Park, St. George, Sundance Resort, Uinta National Forest, Wasatch Cache National Forest, and Zion National Park. Principal photography began in January 1971, but unexpected weather threatened production. Even after Pollack mortgaged his home to supplement the limited budget, production remained constrained. "The snows of St. George in southern Utah were terrible," said Pollack, "and we were using Cinemobiles as the lifelines. There was no way I was going to let it overrun, and Bob was a superb partner in keeping us tight. In the end, it was the greatest way to learn production, because I was playing with my own money." Struggling with weather and the budget, rarely were the crew able to shoot any second takes. The film took 7.5 months to edit. "It's a picture that was made as much in the editing room as it was in the shooting," said Pollack. "It was a film where you used to watch dailies and everybody would fall asleep, except Bob and I, because all you had were these big shots of a guy walking his horse through the snow. You didn't see strong narrative line. It's a picture made out of rhythms and moods and wonderful performances." Music. The score was composed by Tim McIntyre and John Rubinstein, known primarily as actors. They were also musicians. This was their film composing debut, arising after Rubinstein met Sidney Pollack through his agent. As Pollack recalls in the DVD commentary, McIntyre and Rubinstein were kids that just auditioned with a tape. The soundtrack LP was not released until 1976 by Warner Bros. Records. On October 5, 2009, a restored and extended version of the LP was released by Film Score Monthly. Release. Jeremiah Johnson had its worldwide premiere on May 7th at the 1972 Cannes Film Festival, where it was screened in competition. T was the first Western film to ever be accepted in the festival. The film then held its American premiere on December 2nd in Boise, Idaho, with its theatrical release in the United States beginning on December 21st, 1972, in New York City. The film earned $8,350,000 in U.S. and Canadian rentals by the end of 1973. Reissues in 1974 and 1975 saw it earn additional rentals of $10,000 and $4 million, respectively. In the U.S. and Canada, it has grossed $44,693,786 with a reported reissue gross of $20,000. Home media. The film was first released onto DVD by Warner Home Video on October 28, 1997. It was later released onto Blu-ray on May 1, 2012. Critical reception. The film received generally positive reviews. Review aggregator Rotten Tomatoes gave it a fresh rating of 91%, based on reviews from 23 critics, with an average score of 7.110, and the site's consensus stating, "Jeremiah Johnson's deliberate pace demands an investment from the viewer, but it's rewarded with a thoughtful drama anchored by a starring performance from Robert Redford." On Metacritic, it has a score of 75% based on reviews from 7 critics. The New York Times film critic Roger Greenspun noted in his 1972 review that it does not succeed entirely, is perhaps less the fault of the actor or of the conception than of a screenplay that tends to be ponderous about its imponderables and that every so often sounds as if it might have been written by the authors of the Bible. But for all its involvement with academic cinema art, Jeremiah Johnson is full of compensations. There are moments of great beauty and terror and deeply earned pathos. A report in Variety from Cannes stated, "The film has its own force and beauty, and the only carp might lie in its not always clear exegesis of the humanistic spirit and freedom most of its characters are striving for. It is not a new type Western with its demystifications, dirt, and underlining of the brutishness of the times, as well as its heroic aspects, but it does show a deeper insight into the Indian-white relations and benefits from superb direction, excellent lensing, and sharp editing." Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune gave the film 3 stars out of 4 and wrote, "Oddly enough, it is the violent scenes, the ones that don't work within the story, in which Pollack excels. Jeremiah's battle with a pack of wolves and later a pack of Crow Indians are stunning examples of direction and editing." Charles Champlin of the Los Angeles Times praised the film for a rare and tonic authenticity, elaborating that the film does not so much reveal a way of life as thrust us inside it. Making fire with flint and steel looks the miserably frustrating job it is. Hunting and fishing look as exasperating as they are. Snow looks as cold as it is, and hands have the numbed and purpled look it gives them. Gary Arnold of the Washington Post dismissed the film as rather ponderous, as it just sort of moseys along in an academically efficient way without ever generating enough emotion or accumulating enough personal history. It's remarkably even and remarkably uncompelling. Tom Milne of the Monthly Film Bulletin wrote, "Good as it is, with fine performances and superb camera work by Andrew Callaghan, Jeremiah Johnson still disappoints because it aims lower than it might have and does some sleight of hand to conceal the fact." Legacy. The film inspired the creation of the classic Italian comics character and his eponymous publication, Ken Parker. Ken Parker is a Western anti-hero based on Redford's portrayal of Jeremiah Johnson. Like Johnson, Parker is a trapper who had decided to escape from the first city to have appeared in the United States. The comic stories are mainly set in northwestern states at first, but when Parker is forced to flee Boston after he participates in some strikes, initially as a Pinkerton agent and later as a supporter of the workers making the strikes, his new adventures are set along the Canadian frontier. Jeremiah Johnson Review. Jeremiah Johnson, based on Vardis Fisher's novel Mountain Man and a story, Crow Killer, by Raymond W. Thorp and Robert Bunker, is the sort of man of whom legends or sagas are made. Pick leans towards the latter as it meticulously, sans grandiloquence, lays out the life of a male dropout circa 1825 who decides to live in the Rocky Mountains as a trapper. Director Sidney Pollack has given a skilled, observant mounting as he carefully allows the man to grow in experience and know-how. Robert Redford as Johnson has a solid stamina, a fine feel for the speech of the time, giving an autodidactic flair as he sometimes comments the actions. He begins to trade with the Indians and wins the esteem of a Crow Nation chief to whom he gives a present to find he must accept the chief's daughter in return. The film has its own force and beauty, and the only carp might lie in its not always clear exegesis of the humanistic spirit and freedom most of its characters are striving for. Jeremiah Johnson is a 1972 Western film about a lone man's fight for survival in the Rocky Mountains, focusing on revenge, solitude, and man's battle against nature and himself. Robert Redford's portrayal of a former soldier turned mountain man as one of the greatest Western characters of all time epitomizes these themes. Westerns like Jeremiah Johnson often feature vast, untamed landscapes, revenge-driven plots, and introspective characters whose struggles are as internal as they are external. The wilderness becomes a character in its own right, shaping the entire narrative and adding an emotional component to the protagonist's journey. These are movies similar to Jeremiah Johnson, films that share themes of survival, the vast isolation of the wilderness, and deeply personal quests for revenge or redemption. The need for vengeance and the underlying tones of honor and integrity make up the basis for many films in this genre. These westerns focus on character-driven narratives and the rugged beauty and danger of the wilderness. Each film examines violence-laden stories, the harshness of frontier life, the toll on the people living within it, and the greatest Western villains they have to deal with. The Western genre is such a diverse and complex landscape that similar tones and themes can run seamlessly through so many films that seem to be different on the surface. This is a story about a Missouri farmer who becomes an outlaw after pro-Union soldiers murder his wife and young son. As Josie Wales embarks on a journey of revenge, Union soldiers pursue him across the American West. The Outlaw. Josie Wales centers on a solitary figure navigating frontier life's physical and emotional challenges. Eastwood's portrayal of Wales as a man seeking both vengeance and redemption gives the film an emotional arc and intriguing narrative. The sprawling landscapes and the slow, deliberate pacing make The Outlaw Josie Wales a contemplative film about the true cost of violence and the possibility of personal redemption. The character-focused narrative and the focus on Wales' internal struggle make this a powerful addition to any list of introspective westerns. The film's exploration of vengeance, survival, and the consequences of a violent past make it a perfect companion to Jeremiah Johnson. This Western set in 1845 follows a group of pioneers lost in the Oregon desert. The group, led by a questionable guide named Stephen Meek, faces dwindling supplies, uncertainty, and the harsh realities of being unprepared for the wilderness. The film's relaxed pacing and sparse dialogue mirror the quiet tension of Jeremiah Johnson, with the barren desert becoming a central figure in the story. The wilderness is not just a backdrop, but an antagonist, challenging the characters in every situation throughout the movie. Meek's cutoff excels in depicting survival, with the characters' internal and external struggles taking center stage. The film's contemplative nature and exploration of isolation and fear make it a haunting, atmospheric Western without the usual violent gunfights. Meek's cutoff uses the vast, desolate landscape to amplify the characters' emotional journeys, creating a powerful story of survival in an unforgiving world and a beautifully shot Western that has become a modern classic in its genre. This story follows the journey of a young girl, Maddie Ross, who hires a tough, aging U.S. Marshal named Rooster Cogburn, played by John Wayne, to track down her father's killer. The film, set against the vast, desolate wilderness, focuses on justice, revenge, and survival themes. Similar to the cast of Jeremiah Johnson, the central characters are driven by personal vendettas and must navigate harsh terrain as part of their quest for vengeance against those who did them wrong. Like many Westerns, The Wilderness in True Grit is not just a setting, but a character in itself, posing constant physical and psychological challenges to those who venture into it. Rooster Cogburn's journey is as important as the external plot surrounding him, with both films fleshing out arcs of redemption, loneliness, and the cost of living outside of society. The rugged landscapes and the physical endurance required of the characters make True Grit have a natural connection with Jeremiah Johnson. Directed by and starring Tommy Lee Jones, The Homesman tells the story of Mary B. Cuddy, played by Hilary Swank, a frontier woman who, along with a drifter, Jones, is tasked with escorting 3 women showing signs of prairie madness across Nebraska. The film is a bleak and introspective portrayal of the hardships of life on the frontier, where the unforgiving situation reflects the emotional struggles of its characters. As they face dangerous weather, hostile encounters, and their emotional limits, the journey becomes a struggle that threatens to consume them. The Homesman shares Jeremiah Johnson's focus on the wilderness as a formidable adversary like many of the films on this list. The character's forced isolation, both physical and emotional, resonates deeply with Johnson's own journey of survival and revenge, and the lengths one will go to feed their desires. The film's slow pace and contemplative nature allow the audience to delve into its characters' internal struggles, making it an emotionally driven Western that explores the human cost of Western ideals. It tells the story of Ethan Edwards, a Civil War veteran who embarks on a relentless quest to find his niece, who Comanches abducted after killing his nephew and brother's wife. As Ethan travels through hostile terrain, his pursuit becomes one of vengeance and intense obsession. Much like the themes spread throughout Jeremiah Johnson, The Searchers explores the emotional toll of frontier life and the protagonist's growing alienation from society as his quest consumes him in an all-encompassing way. The vast, desolate frontier mirrors Ethan's moral ambiguity and loneliness, with the film presenting a complex character study against a harsh backdrop. The loneliness and single-minded focus of Ethan's journey make this a powerful exploration of vengeance, much like Robert Redford's character's personal struggle in Jeremiah Johnson. Widely regarded as one of the best Westerns ever made, The Searchers remains one of the most compelling depictions of revenge and obsession in Western cinema, with Ford's masterful direction amplifying the epic narrative and expert performances by all involved. In the late 1800s, Hostiles tracks the journey of a conflicted army captain, portrayed by Christian Bale, who is assigned the task of escorting a Cheyenne chief and his family back to their homeland. Throughout the journey, they face hostility from both the elements and their enemies, painting a grim picture of rudimentary survival on the frontier. The film is a reflective journey and maintains a somber tone similar to Jeremiah Johnson, delving into the emotional toll that violence and loss take on individuals. The wilderness becomes a powerful presence in the narrative, with the vast landscapes intensifying the tension and solitude experienced by all the main characters. Hostiles excels in depicting the harshness and beauty of the American frontier, both at times welcoming and calming, yet violent and brutal. The intricate chemistry and relationships between the characters and the personal journey of redemption for Bale's character provide a layered sadness, making it a profound Western film with a contemplative pace akin to Jeremiah Johnson. Starring Clint Eastwood, Joe Kidd narrates the story of a former bounty hunter who becomes involved in a land dispute between Mexican peasants and wealthy American landowners. Set against the dry deserts and rugged mountains of the American Southwest, Kidd initially tries to remain impartial and out of any potential conflict, but is eventually compelled to take a stand against the perceived injustice. Like the 1972 film, Joe Kidd features a protagonist who is forcibly isolated from society and must grapple with personal ethics amid external conflict. The environment Joe Kidd finds himself in plays a crucial role in shaping the storyline. The film explores the connection between humanity and the wilderness, showcasing how survival in such a harsh environment demands physical strength and rare emotional resilience. Eastwood's portrayal of a reluctant hero mirrors Johnson's complex relationship with violence and justice, making Joe Kidd another Western that delves into the personal and moral challenges faced by men living on the fringes of society. Featuring Brad Pitt as the legendary outlaw Jesse James and Casey Affleck as Robert Ford, The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward. Robert Ford is a slower-paced, thoughtful Western that delves into betrayal, infamy, and isolation. The film focuses on the dynamic between James, a charismatic yet increasingly paranoid figure, and Ford, the young man who admires him yet ultimately betrays him. Set against the vast, empty expanses of the American West, the film, like many iconic Westerns, is equally about its characters' internal struggles and the outside world they inhabit. Like Jeremiah Johnson, this film prioritizes character development over action, concentrating on the psychological narrative of its protagonists in one of Brad Pitt's best movies of his career. Pitt's portrayal of Jesse James as a man haunted by his past is excellent, and his charisma is evident in every scene. Casey Affleck's nuanced performance as a man torn between admiration and envy makes The Assassination of Jesse James a haunting exploration of the complexities of human relationships in a lawless time. The bitterness, confusion, and frustration he feels after killing his friend perfectly sums up the double-edged quest for justice and revenge. Starring Charlton Heston and Brian Keith, The Mountain Men portrays two aging fur trappers navigating the perils of the Rocky Mountains and the local Native Americans. The film offers a rugged depiction of the trappers' life, rife with danger, seclusion, and the ever-present threat of hostile Native American tribes. Heston and Keith's characters live on the outskirts of society, much like Jeremiah Johnson, surviving based on their knowledge of the land and their ability to endure the harsh conditions they find themselves in. The film combines survival and action with several brutal instances, reminding the viewer of the literal life-and-death nature of their lives. The Mountain Men also focuses on the personal connections formed in such extreme circumstances and the bonds you have to create to survive. The cinematography captures the splendor and brutality of the mountains, creating a striking backdrop for the trappers' struggles. It remains a vivid portrayal of men in isolation, battling nature and their sense of purpose in a changing, violent world. Man in the Wilderness tells the story of Zachary Bass, a fur trapper abandoned by his comrades after being viciously mauled by a bear. Bass, played by Richard Harris, must navigate the unforgiving frontier in a bid for survival, determined to exact revenge on those who left him to die. This film emphasizes the protagonist's battle against the wilderness, with the Rocky Mountains as the omnipresent enemy. Bass's journey from victim to survivor to conqueror is central to the narrative and creates an engaging story. The film is reflective and haunting, with a slow-burn intensity that focuses on the internal struggles of its protagonist after a devastating attack that left many physical and emotional scars. Its powerful depiction of man's battle with nature mirrors the 1972 film's portrayal of resilience and revenge. Man in the Wilderness uses the potential for death to heighten the tension, making survival itself one of the film's core challenges. The introspective pacing and thematic exploration of revenge and survival make it similar to Jeremiah Johnson, and a must-watch if you want to watch something with the same themes. Sydney Pollack is not always given the respect that he deserves as being one of the greatest filmmakers in history, and that may be because he has worked with such a diverse number of genres. Between a Best Picture-winning historical epic, Out of Africa, a haunting paranoia thriller, 3 Days of the Condor, a classic adventure romance, The Electric Horseman, an all-time great comedy, Tootsie, and a brilliant courtroom thriller, Absence of Malice, Pollack was able to dip his toes into a variety of different filmmaking styles. Although it may be a challenge to identify recurring motifs within his work, Pollack's filmography was distinguished by his frequent collaborations with Robert Redford. Pollack directed Redford to bring out one of his best performances ever in the survival thriller Jeremiah Johnson, which doubled as a subversive Western adventure. Based on an incredible true story, Jeremiah Johnson stars Redford as a legendary Mexican-American war veteran who decided to isolate himself from the rest of society by becoming a mountain man in the Rocky Mountains. While America had become a more expansive nation through the acquisition of new territories, few had been settled with legitimate governments, which gave men like Johnson the opportunity to explore without risk of disturbing local law enforcement. Johnson is taught his trade by the established mountain man Bear Claw Chris Lapp, Will Geer, and later falls in love with the indigenous woman Swan Della Bolton, whom he marries. However, the life of his young family is soon put in danger when a feud with a rival tribe threatens to put them all in danger and forces Johnson to return to the violent ways he had thought he had left behind forever. Jeremiah Johnson was an integral film for Redford's career, as he had previously proven himself to be more of a heartthrob thanks to his charismatic performances in Downhill Racer and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. While Redford does excel in some of the film's more intimate scenes between Johnson and Swan, where he is able to show his romantic side, his performance is quite grim and examines the taxing effects that age has on a man. Even though Johnson was relatively young when he first made his expedition, the film emphasizes that being a veteran in such an ugly conflict has discolored his perception of what humanity is capable of. Although being able to become a husband and father was able to revive his sense of optimism, the danger he met during his encounter with the Crow natives served as a reminder that danger will always rear its ugly head. Redford's ability to play such a dark, wounded character was certainly important as he began making more serious films in the next decade, including The Candidate, All the President's Men, and The Great Waldo Pepper. Although the eventual battle with the different tribe provides the film with its most exciting action set piece, Jeremiah Johnson succeeded by showing the nuances of survival and how taxing it could be, both physically and mentally. While being separated from the cities and communities that represented his past was important in Johnson's ability to cope with his severe post-traumatic stress disorder, he was also a stranger who had to fight each and every day to preserve his own life. The film was able to explore the complexity of his mindset, although it took considerable effort to search for resources, build shelters, and defend his territory. Johnson benefited from the sense of independence that he earned from being a mountain man. Jeremiah Johnson was an important film within the revisionist Western movement, in which films attempted to ground themselves in reality and paid attention to key moments of historical context. The film was also noteworthy in its depiction of Native Americans. Although the Blackfoot clan is depicted as being villainous, Jeremiah Johnson goes out of its way to indicate that not all indigenous tribes were the same. While its moody atmosphere and downbeat tone may have made it less accessible, Jeremiah Johnson may be the crowning achievement within Pollack's series of collaborations with Redford. The film's sparse groughs of dialogue overflow with subtext, as does the opening number by Tim McIntyre, who sweetly lifts that a story doesn't always go all the way you had in mind. Jeremiah's story was that kind. After a silent stare-down with the Crow Chief paints his shirt red, Johnson is found by a colorful crank named Bearclaw Lapp, who in a bit of foreshadowing lives as though he were a Blackfoot himself, and initiates Johnson's long, torturous education in the ways of the mountain man, calling him Pilgrim. Lapp scolds Johnson for longing after female company. Hein insists that a woman's breast is the hardest rock the Almighty ever made on this earth. But lest viewers begin to despair they'll never see Redford shirtless again, he comes across a cabin that's been marooted by Blackfeet, including a mute young boy and his raving mad mother. The only survivors, Johnson adopts the boy. The mother dissolves like many characters into the landscape that surrounds Johnson but never touches him again. Whether this episodic blurring of narrative and symbolic strokes was intentional on the part of Pollack or by John Milius and Edward Arnold is hard to figure, but it's an interesting feature and a bellwether of the film's ambitions to be a proper Western without a sustained narrative arc. Johnson and the boy meet another gregarious trapper named Goo, whose feelings about Indians aren't anywhere near as gentile as Lapp's. The two fight off a Blackfoot ambush, and Pollack tries his hand at editing for action, often choreographing the same tumbles, kicks, punches, and gunfire for different angles, and then cutting aggressively between them. As close a response in montage to Peake's so-dubbed balletic emphasis on juxtaposing slow and regular speed as is visible in studio-made revisionist westerns. Goosen and the boy are intercepted by a different tribe. This time God-fearing flatheads who hate the Blackfeet almost as much as Gudos. Johnson nobly attempts to turn the page by offering them the scalps and horses from the prior battle, but offends the chief into upping his generosity with a gift of his own, his comely daughter Swan. And so Johnson, the mute boy, and Swan set out to live again, peacefully making a log cabin from scratch, pelting bears to keep warm. These domestic scenes comprise the film's midsection and their politics, if era awfully creaky. Once Swan and Johnson start actually having sex, he realizes his beard has been scratching her face. The quivering wind section that greets Redford shaven seems designed to signal a turning point in their understanding of each other. A cavalry shows up near Johnson's home in search of an abandoned missionary wagon. Head advises the Megans passing through as a Cred Crow burial ground. They do anyway, and Johnson returns from a hunting trip to find both Swan and the mute boy killed. Soit goes suffering on account of his attempt to work with his surroundings rather than against them. Johnson treks out in solitude again, regrowing his beard and, of course, killing more Indians. Whenever Redford and the natives engage in battle, the blocking and rhythm of the scenes stakes on an almost feral quality with the directors, so emphatic on pushing their brutality that they become more brutal but less realistic during quiet moments. Johnson stares into the distance with a hard glint in his eye. Statue Pollack's design is lob-jammed between the relatively humorless widescreen Technicolor panoramas of yesteryear and the soft-focused telephoto explorations of the time. Whereas Robert Allyn and Vilmo Zsigmond managed in McCabe and Mrs. Miller to enshroud their characters among blankets of snow and pine trees as optical vespers, uneasy blots moving across landscapes, Pollack and his cinematographer tend to stick with regular wide and medium shots, especially for dialogue scenes with giant mountainsides shoved in the background. That's Jeremiah Johnson to eighths and which between mood and character, with no real definitive linkage of either a noddly straight-laced attempt to conjure a miracle from prime ingredients with plenty of care, but no real thought of their arrangement. The intent seems to be Robert Redford plus beard plus fiddle music plus pine trees equals Thorough Redford reportedly was at bearer at the 1972 reburial of the real Johnson in Kodai, Wyoming. It is an especially messianic type of Hollywood film that allows its leading man to be both hero and victim. Jeremiah Johnson is a 1972 American Western film directed by Sidney Pollack and starring Robert Redford as the title character and Will Gia's Bearclaw Chris Lapp. It is based partly on the life of the legendary mountain man John Jeremiah Johnson, recounted in Raymond Thorp and Robert Bunker's book Crow Killer. The saga of liver-retating Johnson and Vardis Fisher's 1965 novel Mountain Manuscript was written by John Milius and Edward Arnold. The film was shot at various locations in Redford's adopted home state of Utah. It was entered into the 1972 Cannes Film Festival on May 7, 1972, and was later released on December 21, 1972 by Warner Brothers Pictures. The film received very positive reviews from critics and was a box office success, earning $44.7 million budget of $3.1 million, making it the sixth highest grossing film of 1972 movie plot. Mexican War veteran Jeremiah Johnson takes up the life of a mountain man, supporting himself in the Rocky Mountains as a trapper. His first winter in mountain country is difficult, and he has a run-in with Paints His Shirt Red, a chief of the Crow tribe. He starts out with a .30 caliber Holland percussion rifle, which he uses as Shee's main rifle until he finds the frozen body of mountain man Hatchet Jack. Clutching a .050 caliber Hawan rifle, Jaxwell gives his rifle to the man who finds his corpse with his new rifle. Johnson inadvertently disrupts the grizzly bear hunt of the elderly and eccentric Chris Lapp, nicknamed Bearclaw, who mentors him on living in the high country. After a brush with crows, including Lapp's acquaintance, Paints His Shirt Red and learning the skills required to survive, Johnson sets off on his own. He comes across a cabin whose inhabitants were apparently attacked by Blackfoot warriors, leaving only a woman and her uncommunicative son alive. The woman maddened by grief forces Johnson to adopt her son. He and the boy, whom Johnson dubs Caleb, come across Delgue, mountain man who has been robbed by the Blackfeet and buried by them up to his neck in sin. Gu persuades Johnson to help recover his stolen goods, but Johnson counsels against violence when they find the Blackfoot camp. Thiemen sneak into the camp at night to retrieve Gu's possessions, but Gu opens fire and the mountain men kill the Blackfeet. Gu takes several Blackfoot horses and scouts. Johnson, disgusted with the needless killing, returns to Caleb. Soon afterward, they are surprised by Christianized Flatheads, who take them in as guests of honor. Johnson unknowingly places the chief in his debt by giving him the Blackfeet horses and scalps. According to Flathead custom to maintain his honor, the chief must now either give his guest a greater gift or kill him. The chief gives his daughter Swan to be Johnson's bride. After the wedding, Hugh goes off on his own, and Johnson, Caleb, and Swan journey into the wilderness. Johnson finds a suitable location to build a cabin. They settle into this new home and slowly become a family. This idyllic life is interrupted by the arrival of a U.S. Army cavalry rescue party, tasked with saving a stranded wagon train of settlers. Although Johnson is reluctant, he is pressed into guiding the rescue party through the mountains, leaving his family alone at their cabin. During the journey, Lieutenant Mulvey orders the party to proceed directly through a sacred Crow burial ground against Johnson's advice. Afterward, Johnson returns home by the same route and notices that the graves are now adorned with Swan's blue trinkets. He rushes back to the cabin where he finds both Swan and Caleb have been killed. Johnson sets off after the warriors who killed his family and attacks them, killing all but one, a heavy-set man who sings his death song when he realizes he cannot escape. Johnson leaves him alive, and the survivor spreads the tale of the mountain man's quest for revenge throughout the region, trapping Johnson in a feud with the Crow. The tribe sends its best warriors one at a time to kill Johnson, but he defeats each one. His legend grows, and the Crow come to respect him. He meets Gu again, and Quallen and his family are living there. Nearby, the Crow have built a monument to Johnson's bravery, periodically leaving trinkets and talismans as tribute. Johnson and Lapp meet for a final time. It is at this poignant meeting between student and teacher that Lapp realizes the heavy toll that fighting an entire nation alone in a vast and lonesome frontier has taken on Johnson. Lapp indicates as much when he remarks that Johnson has come far, to which Johnson replies, "Feels like far." Lapp then queries, "Were it worth the trouble? What trouble?" Johnson replies Johnson later has a wordless encounter with Paints His Shirt Red, presumed to be behind the attacks while sitting astride their horses far apart. Johnson reaches for his rifle, but Paints His Shirt Red raises his arm open, palmed in a gesture of peace that Johnson slowly returns, signaling an end to their conflict. The film ends with the song lyrics, and some folks say he's up there still. Cast Robert Redford as Jeremiah Johnson, Will Jai as Bearclaw, Chris Lapp, Stefan Gierasch as Delgu Del Bolton as Swan, Josh Orby as Caleb Wen Martinez as Paints His Shirt Red, Allyn McLerie. The crazy woman Paul Benedict as Reverend Linquist, Jack Corvin as Lieutenant Mulvey, Matt Clark as Quallen Richard, Angarola as Chief Two Tongs Leos, Charles Tiener as Robidu, Tanya Tucker as Quaylen's daughter. Production in April. 1968, producer Sidney Beckerman acquired the film rights to the biographical book Crow Killer. The Saga of Liver-Eating Johnson by Raymond W. Thorp Jr. and Robert Bunker. By May 1970, the rights were acquired by Warner Brothers, who assigned John Milius to write a screen adaptation based roughly on Crowiller, as well as Mountain Man, a novel of male and female in the early American West by Vardis Fisher. Milius first scripted what would become known as Jeremiah Johnson for $5,000. However, he was then hired to rewrite it several times and eventually earned $80,000, equivalent to $650,000 in 2024. According to Milius, Edward Arnold and David Rayfield were brought in to work on the screenplay only for Milius to be continually rehired because no one else could do the dialogue. Milius says he got the idiom and American spirit from Carl Sandburg and was also influenced by Charles Porras's novel True Grit. The role of Jeremiah Johnson was originally intended for Lee Marvin and then Clint Eastwood, with Sam Peckinpah to direct. However, Peckinpah and Eastwood did not get along, so Peckinpah left and Eastwood decided to make Dirty Harry instead. Warner Brothers then stepped in and set up Milius' screenplay for Robert Redford without a director. Redford talked Sidney Pollack into it. The two were looking for another film to collaborate on after this property is condemned 1966. Casting for the role of Swan, Jeremiah's wife, took 3 months. After auditioning for another role, actress Dell Bolton was spotted by the casting director, followed up by her participation in the UK School of Theatre Arts Hugh O'Brien Awards competition. Bolton then interviewed alongside 200 Native American women and eventually won the role, even though she herself was not Native American. Filming. After Warner Brothers advanced Redford $200,000 to secure him for the film, Warner decided that the film had to be shot on the studio's back due to cost constraints, insisting that it must be shot on location in Utah. Redford and Pollack convinced the studio that this could be done at the same cost. To prepare for production, art director Ted Howarth drove over 26,000 miles to find locations. Ultimately, it was shot in nearly 100 locations across Utah, including Mount Timpanogos, Ashley National Forest, Leaded Snow Canyon State Park, St. George Sundance Resort, Uint National Forest, Wasatch Cache National Forest, and Zion National Park. Principal photography began in January 1971, but unexpected weather threatened production. Even after Pollack mortgaged his home to supplement the limited budget, production remained constrained. The snows of St. George in southern Utah were terrible, said Pollack, and we were using cinnamoils as the lifelines. There was no way I was going to let it overrun, and Bob was a superb partner in keeping us tight. In the end, it was the greatest way to learn production because I was playing with my own money, struggling with weather and the budget. Rarely were the crew able to shoot any second takes. The film took 7.5 months to edit. It's a picture that was made as much in the editing room as it was in the shooting, said Pollack. It was a film where you used to watch dailies and everybody would fall asleep except Bob and I because all you had were these big shots of a guy walking his horse through the snow. You didn't see strong narrative line. It's a picture made out of rhythms and moods and wonderful performances, music. The score was composed by Tim McIntyre and John Rubinstein, known primarily as actors. They were also musicians. This was their film composing debut, arising after Rubinstein met Sidney Pollack through his agent. As Pollack recalls in the DVD commentary, McIntyre and Rubinstein were kids that just auditioned with a tape. The soundtrack LP was not released until 1976 by Warner Brothers Records. On October 5, 2009, a restored and extended version of the LP was released by Film Score Monthly Release. Jeremiah Johnson had its worldwide premiere on May 7th at the 1972 Cannes Film Festival, where it was screened in competition. It was the first Western film to ever be accepted in the festival. The film then held its American premiere on December 2nd in Boise, Idaho, with its theatrical release in the United States beginning on December 21st, 1972 in New York City. The film earned $8,350,000 in U.S. and Canadian rentals by the end of 1973. Reshoots in 1974 and 1975 saw it earn additional rentals of $10 million and $4 million respectively. In the U.S. and Canada, it has grossed $144,667,86 with a reported reissue gross of $25 million. Home media. The film was first released onto DVD by Warner Home Video on October 28, 1997. It was later released onto Blu-ray on May 1, 2012. Jeremiah Johnson movie review. Sorry for the dated movie poster styled headline, but as the silliest Twitter trend of last week was some young Ling's assertion that I was this minutes old, when it found out Robert Redford was Jeremiah Johnson, one does feel the need to state the obvious. That's Twitter. For you, our Geer, a Lonkin round table of wit and deep cinematic wisdom. And you wonder why I put links in all my reviews defining this or historically identifying that it's ridiculous to expect somebody born any time after, say, Bill Clinton's inaugural to automatically have absorbed a century of cinema history. Although, as Redford was clean-shaven for 2 sequences in this 1972 film and being the biggest star in Hollywood for a stretch of the 70s and ale-adding man, pretty much to this very day, let's just say your tweeter was either being cute and disingenuous or stupid. Jeremiah Johnson came along after the first Earth Day and the birth of the environmental movement, and at the tail end of the hippie back to the land ethos that took hold in the late 60s. It's a 1970s it western, easily conflated with the attitudes and mores and movies and TV shows of its time. There's respect for Native American culture and customs of a little big man variety, even though casting white actors as indigenous people was very much prevalent. The title character is a soldier who's turned pacifist with a desire to leave all that's down there in the States. It wasn't the first film to venerate the solitary mountain man, but it was the best its success inspired the less hunting, trapping, killing-oriented kids' TV movie and series, The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams. A couple of years later, Tough Guy's screenwriter and later Conan the Barbarian director John Milius had a hand in the script, which grafts a bloody short story of revenge onto the basic structure and plot of a novel about a mountain man's life in the unpacified West. The time setting is sometime after the War of 1812 and right up to the Mexican War 1840s, which is referenced. Redford's title character shows up in uniform and a Priver Wharf in the Colorado Territory, loads up supplies and heads off looking for beaver and such to trap those who love this film, and I count myself among them. Tend to remember it in episodes, which in my case I have to say turn up out of order. Something I realize anytime I see it anew, there's his first encounter with a Native American, paints his shirt red as a stern, noble warrior, underwhelmed by the white man's fishing and trapping skills. Jeremiah memorably comes upon the trapper deluxe, the wonderful character actor Stefan Gierasch, omnipresent in the 70s, a bald blowhard buried up to his neck in sand by less friendly tribesmen. That's the way Pollack, Milius, and co-writer Edward Arne hold structure this, with Pollack casting colorful supporting players for Redford to play straight man too in many of the scenes. Character actress and TV. Regular Allyn and McLerie plays the saddest of these, a settler who has gone mad because of the slaughter the Crows have visited upon her family. Redford has his first choice close-up here as he sobers her up, if only for a moment, but the scene stealer among scene stealers in Jeremiah Johnson is that long, blacklisted leftist Grandpa Walton himself. Well, Geer is the old-timer and mentor figure covered in fur and beard and bare teeth. He is a grizz hunter, a collector of fangs, long in the tooth and loud of the mouth, dealing with this pilgrim on his turf. I am Bearclaw Chris, lap bloodkin to the grizzer that bit Jim Bridges' ass. You are molesting my hunt, and you're the same dumb pilgrim that I've been here in for 20 days and smelling for 3. Geer is the highlight of the movie. Although there are other colorful moments and characters and plenty of blood sport and action in the vengeance-packed third act, Pollack had a deft hand with lighter moments which made Redford his perfect muse. Watch the way the pilgrim falls down. Most every time he has to fire that .50 caliber rifle at something or someone. Redford had already fallen in love with Utah thanks to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And what's striking about Jeremiah all these years later is the epic feeling that what is essentially an intimate and episodic story gets across. Pollack made a big movie with stunning scenery, Dr. Zhivago, depth snow, Indian fighting, and a touch of domesticity that, along with the use of the hymn, Shall We Gather at the River, feels like a nod to the Western master John Ford. Pollack and Redford would work together often, as you'd expect of a director of romances and a guy he helped make the great Mediterranean idol of his day. They made 7 films together, including 2 that were among Redford's edgier pictures of his heyday: the spy thriller 3 Days of the Condor and the even flintier Jeremiah Johnson. 4 years Redford was lightly regarded as an actor. And you can sense that lightweight label just a tad, and a comfort in sharing scenes with actors given more colorful roles in this performance. His line readings of the archaic speech may not sound as natural as you'd like. He has modern Californian baggage that was hard to shake back then, but I think it's among Redford's most endearing and enduring performances. A sensitive yet heroic figure, a man out of his depth who has to grow and revert to a form of savagery to master it. Who cares if his period-appropriate farewell isn't the smoothest line reading ever? There are lots of movies on my list of shame. If it was released before the 60s, there's a solid chance I haven't seen it, but that doesn't mean I'm not interested in it. So you can come here to read about my first experience with movies. I feel like I should have probably watched by now. And this isn't limited to older classics, if it's a movie I'm interested in, but just happen to miss. Playing Catch Up is the series where you can find my thoughts on it. Over the years, my dad has recommended quite a few movies to me that he enjoyed from when he was younger. The list includes, but is not limited to, Field of Dreams, Rudy, Dances with Wolves has Jeremiah Johnson. I've knocked a few of these off the list over time. But until the recent emergence of streaming, it wasn't easy to get a hold of movies you didn't own, making this a difficult project. But 1972's Jeremiah Johnson, starring Robert Redford, was just added to HBO Max, and I felt like that made it the perfect time to finally check it out. My journey with Redford has only really started in the last year or so. Other than MCU movies, I've watched Butch, Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, All the President's Men, The Natural, and now Jeremiah Johnson for the first time within the last 12 months. I've developed respect for what Redford was able to do when he was at the height of his powers. And I'll definitely be watching more of his films going forward. But as for Jeremiah Johnson specifically, this is the kind of movie that I'm usually drawn to. It reminds me of some more recent films such as Into the Wild and the Best Picture winner Nomad Land, as it's about someone going away from normal society to try to find some sort of meaning, fulfillment, or purpose out on their own in an alternative lifestyle. The difference with Jeremiah Johnson is that it takes place in the mid-1800s. The film follows Jeremiah Johnson, a veteran of the Mexican-American War, who decides he wants to become a mountain man and goes off to the Rocky Mountains to live the life of a loner. Upon entering the wilderness to begin his new life, he finds a man frozen and dead in the cold. Rocky Mountain winter. He has written out a will which says whoever finds his dead body can have his .50 caliber rifle, which of course Jeremiah takes. It's a daunting omen for what a life alone in the wild could look like for Jeremiah. If he's not careful, he continues his journey where he meets Bearclaw, a man who lives out in the wild hunting grizz. He gives Jeremiah some pointers about living this kind of life before Jeremiah is off again looking for something. Though it's not exactly clear what Jeremiah subsequently comes across, a house with a woman in hysterics, because Native Americans, they're called Indians in the movie, but I'll stick to calling them Native Americans, have killed almost her whole family. Apart from her mute son, Jeremiah tries to help her however he can, but the only thing she really wants him to do is to take her son with him because she thinks he'll be better off with Jeremiah. Since the boy can't talk and the woman doesn't tell him a name, Jeremiah names him Caleb. After some more chance encounters, Jeremiah finds himself in an unlikely position where a Native American chief is offering him his daughter Swan to be his wife, like taking on Caleb as his adopted son. Marrying a Native American isn't something Jeremiah was planning on or wanted to do, but it was the situation he found himself in. And one of the main character traits we see in him is that he has a sense of duty, honor, and integrity. So he takes Swan to be his wife, and the three of them, Jeremiah, Swan, and Caleb, go off to find a good place to settle. They find a clearing next to a river and decide to cut down trees, build a cabin, and settle there. And this section is where the movie really started to become meaningful to me. Jeremiah, a man who wishes to be a loner and live a life mostly away from other people, is all of a sudden forced into a situation where he's around two other people 24/7, and neither of these people is able to talk to him. Caleb is mute, and Swan speaks a different language. This section of the movie gets into the importance of human connection. Even though he can't communicate verbally with his newfound family, they are still there. They play games and work together and develop a good row with each other, and we begin to see this is where Jeremiah is really starting to thrive. Their cabin in the Rocky Mountains, living off the land and being together, seems to bring a sense of happiness and fulfillment to Jeremiah that we hadn't yet seen. Up to this point, there were lots of melancholy but beautiful shots of Jeremiah on his horse, traipsing through the unknown of the wilderness, foraging for what food and resources she could find, but it turned a corner once he settled with his new family and overcame the foreboding of the frozen man. Sadly, this perfect life doesn't last for very long. Jeremiah is recruited by members of the USA Army to help save a stranded wagon train of settlers on the sacred burial ground of a Native American tribe. He reluctantly complies, but upon returning home he finds his family murdered by the very tribe whose ground they tramped on. This leads to great subtle acting from Redford. Instead of wailing in grief or destroying things in anger, hesitates and stares for what seems like hours. The rest of the movie returns to the melancholic and uncertain feeling of the beginning of the film. Jeremiah attempts a revenge tour against the Native Americans that killed his family. In response, they send warriors after him, and he consistently fights to defend himself. Eventually, he returns to the house where he found Caleb. The new residents tell him that the Native Americans should have been building a monument to him. And when Jeremiah encounters one of the Native Americans for the last time, there's finally an understanding of peace between the two. Ultimately, Jeremiah Johnson is a tragic film that still holds up to this day. It's about lost regret and finding a purpose in life. Sidney Pollack's direction and the cinematography by Duke Callahan create an atmosphere of thoughtfulness about what it means to have human connection and the true fulfillment that it brings. Redford's stoic yet charismatic performance keeps you invested, even when the story can feel a bit slow. This is one that I'm glad that I finally got around to watching, and I'll be revisiting in the future. Other information about this film. Starring Robert Redford's burly Manette, Jeremiah Johnson is the story of an absolutely incredible beard and the mountain man who carries it around on his face. The beard just wants to live a quiet life, moving gently in the Rocky Mountain breeze and catching a few snowflakes, but other forces dwelling in the range cause trouble for the beard. As seasons pass in the valleys below, the beard widens to the truths of the world and becomes a broader, more understanding beard. Sidney Pollack directed 5 or 6 films. 5. Including 1969's They Shoot Horses, Don't They? If you count 1968's The Swimmer, which Pollack eventually took over without an actual directing credit, and plenty of TV, before he got to Jeremiah Johnson in 1972. Not long before production began, it was Clint Eastwood in Johnson's role and Sam Peckinpah set to direct him. But the pair clashed, and Eastwood said, "Dirty Harry sounds a lot less dangerous," paraphrased, and Redford was cast in his place, having worked together on this property as Condemned in 1966. It was Redford who secured Pollack as Peckinpah's replacement. Contrary to what one may think when watching Redford ride around on horseback for 2 hours, Jeremiah Johnson actually cost quite a bit of money, and it was money that the studio wasn't prepared to give out after advancing Redford a hefty salary. Pollack mortgaged his house and financed parts of the film himself, all the while strictly adhering to the budgetary and time constraints the studio laid down. In short, you wouldn't blame Pollack for being a bit sour after such a stressful production. But the director cited it as a great trial-by-fire learning experience, essentially because the money he was risking was his own. It probably helped that Johnson did well and remains a bit of a mountain men classic today. The kernel of the film, at least for me, comes when Jeremiah sits by a freshly killed dinner with his de facto family, a wife he was all but forced to marry, and a son he was all but forced to adopt. First, the irony of a man sojourning to the Rockies to live a life of quiet solitude and ending up married with a kid is a rich one. As they sit around munching rabbit or whatever, Jeremiah teaches his non-English speaking wife a new word. Yes, he then asks her some questions about himself, the last of which is, "I am a fine figure of a man." Yes. Now this lady has no idea what in the hell this guy is talking about. She's goaded into answering, all the same showing off her new word. Yes, Jeremiah sits back satisfied. A definition of manhood in any form validity. Apparently, notwithstanding, keeps cropping up in Jeremiah Johnson. He achieves legendary status among some of the puny town dwellers, achieves something of a nemesis status among a tribe of Crow Indians, and achieves something that begins as spitty but matures into respect with two like-minded mountain men. What of himself does being aim and equal living a full life, or is there a gap there somewhere that leaves this manly man's minutely unfulfilled? Pollack and Redford managed to pull an extremely strong narrative out of what could easily have been a semblance of shots of Jeremiah riding a horse. The beard helps tragically. The Beard's career went sharply downhill following Jeremiah Johnson and was hardly ever seen in Hollywood, again sinking into a drunken oblivion and leading a shattered existence that would one day serve as the basis for leaving Las Vegas. I don't manage to watch as many westerns as I'd like to. No real reason. I tend to bypass them when I'm ready for a film. Usually prefer to opt for a thriller, something dark, a drama, saying that one of my top 10 films could possibly be a western. Will one day soon do an article on that mystical western I do so love. However, chatting about favorite westerns with Todd, my film buddy over at Cinema Monolith, it was raised that Jeremiah Johnson wasn't of his the Sidney Pollack directed one with that Robert Redford fella. I didn't know it. Well, I'd heard of it, never seen it. To be honest, I didn't know anything about it other than the title, and Mr. Redford done's a big-ass beard in it. Actually, whilst watching the film, I realized I'd used the gif of beardy, smiley, nodding Redford in a few text messages over the years and never realized maybe it was Grizzly Adams, a wild Zach Galifianakis megaf topic. Never watching films and seeing famous gifs has no happened twice in 2 days. Introduced Happy Gilmore. 1996, Thomas and Kofi halfway through. We get a happy love interest, the character Virginia She. Turns up in Fantasy Dream and Sexy Laundry. But sexier than her in Suspenders is the fact she's carrying not one big flag of beer, but two. Oh my days, I guess what's worrying is how did I forget that sequence of events? I'd been happily forwarding that message out over the years for our Friday Boys pub nights. Haha, total oblivious to the fact that I really should have remembered where it came from. Not only that I then just learned that the girl with the lovely beverages is Julie Bowen, otherwise known as Claire Dunny from Modern Family, I never realized even whilst watching just a few days ago. So as you can see, I rarely, if ever, goof topic, deal it back in Mikey. I know everyone left already, but dude, get back on track. What was I doing, Austern? Oh, yes, Jeremiah Johnson. Yes, Mikey, you back lockdown was here. I'm not watching as many films as I had first imagined. Kind of thought I'd be knocking numbers like 3 a day. In reality, it's about 5 a week. Pretty much no change from normal. The day still flies on by as if I was at work. Putting the death, chaos, and destruction to one side, I've been extremely humbled to have been able to spend beautiful time with my family, eating together, walks, and exercise together every day. It's been lovely. Then, in a blink of an eye, the call comes from work. And it all comes to an end next week. Time to run back up the road for more beer. Drown my sorrow's supplies. Jeremiah Johnson, disillusioned by fighting in the Mexican War of 1846, decides to live the life of a mountain man, to live an almost hermit existence in the bleak winter months of the Rocky Mountains of Northern America, to live off the land as a trapper hunting for his food and becoming one with the wilderness. His first winter is arduous. He's not adept or skilled enough for the harshness of his new chosen home, a land designed to kill you. The story of Jeremiah Johnson is like an epic Ulysses journey. You follow him right through his learning curve, voyage of survival. Fortune follows his good spirit in the beginning months as she meets a series of characters, each helping him in differing ways. The first is the crazy eccentric Chris Lepaka Bearclaw. He's a friendly soul, a bonkers old codge, obsessed with hunting grizzly bears. He helps Jeremiah learn the skills he will require to survive. More detail, Ida's 1972, and you have a Western with Robert Redford in it. With that in mind, what's most surprising about Jeremiah Johnson is what it somehow manages not to be a revisionist challenge to the genre hell by 72. Even conservative Westerns were mostly revisionist, and one starring a man notable for his liberal politics would seem to be a surefire candidate for a downbeat commentary on American culture and values set in a pointedly metaphorical frontier wilderness. The pointedly metaphorical wilderness part now that Jeremiah Johnson has down pat, but everything else about the movie is astonishingly old-fashioned. Ida's a real damn stately thing conceived, an obvious tribute to the undying Moff the West and playing surprisingly straight with the idea that for a man to truly find himself, he must journey to the edge of civilization and lose himself in the isolation of nature. Perhaps this would be better if it had a more satiric questioning edge. Maybe that would just make it seem fashionably cynical. I would hardly call Jeremiah Johnson a bad movie, though it's one whose ambition frequently outpaces its execution. It's very weird, though, given its historic context. The film was originally a fact-derived blood-and-guts epic, fashioned by credited co-writer John Milius, according to his own private fascinations with violent masculinity, until Sidney Pollack got involved and had his people Delius it. The result is mostly a meditative treatment of physical landscapes as an extension of quietly tormented internal psychology. Sometime near the end of the Mexican-American War, one Jeremiah Johnson Redford decided to abandon the corrupting influence of civilization to journey to the Rocky Mountains, to pursue the life of a grizzled old trapper. This is where we meet him. That is to say, where we meet him in the flesh, after a rather questionable bit of opening narration that suggests what might have happened if Yozite Sam had gone into poetry rather than vomit hunting, as well as a drop-dead ad. Hokey Seven's folk-type song telling us all about how Jeremiah Johnson Jays wanted to forget his troubles, having a really hard time making it through his first winter. After a distant encounter with a crow warrior who will weave his way in and out of the movie, who we'll get to know as paints his shirt red. When Martinez Johnson finds two other white hunters, one of them is dead and serves mainly to show us in the audience just how merciless the Rockies could be, as well as to provide Johnson with a better gun. The other Chris Bearclaw lap is of rather more active help, giving Johnson a crash course in mountainman life. And from here, Jeremiah Johnson is only in the most literal sense a continuous narrative. Watching it, one has the sense of discrete events unfolding over the course of what could be months or years in Johnson's life. Very much part of the point of the thing, I suspect, is that time somewhat ceases to have much actual meaning, as Johnson mostly succeeds in dropping out of the unguy-nanely flow of urban American life, and instead finds himself living by the rhythm of the mountains. As I take it, we're meant to understand that life removed from the artificial structures of the civilized world loses that world's obsession with causality and conflict, and so narrative itself starts to loosen up and go slack. Jeremiah Johnson can't have a clear series of events that bleed into each other, because Jeremiah Johnson's experience of life no longer function that way. Instead, there are certain key moments interspersed with wandering states of being. It's such an extraordinary way of assembling a film plot that it's not really to anybody's discredit that it doesn't always quite work. In practice, the anti-continuity I've just described looks very much like exceptionally well-done sequences, studded into a whole that's a bit less than the sum of its parts. Even so, those parts can be very good. The early sequence in which Johnson discovers his dead frozen colleague is absolutely terrific, for example, and it comes early enough that it casts a glow over much of what follows. Howard Hawks once famously claimed that to be perceived as good, a movie needs 3 great scenes and no bad ones. My own formula is that a movie needs a great opening scene and a great closing shot, and Jeremiah Johnson nails both of those. The whole introductory act is great, really, with Duke Callahan's cinematography, capturing the endless snow of the Rocky Mountain winter as a living entity, not a field of dead white, but a landscape of shifting reflections and textures and shapes that seems much more active and conscious than the people milling about on it. That remarkable sense of presence, coupled with Redford's exceedingly fine work playing a mostly unspeaking man with a giant beard and a sad, desperate look behind his eyes, goes a hell of a long way to making Jeremiah Johnson interesting right away. And while I don't know that the film gets back to that level, the best parts linger. What happens is that Johnson acquires both an adopted white son, Josh Albee, and a flathead Indian wife, and manages to make an enemy of the Crow after defiling their sacred grounds when pressed into duty as a U.S. cavalry scout. This gives the film's second hour somewhat more shape than its first and places it vaguely, but not quite in the tradition of whites versus engines western since time immemorial, replacing the triumphant tenor of those movies with a more ambivalent, weary one, which pays off nicely in the final scene. It's still awfully plotless and episodic, mind you, and there's very little sense that things are building in any direction, which I think I admire. Thought there's little doubt that the early part of the film is generally more interesting and effective than the latter. There's something generally stitched together about the whole of Jeremiah Johnson, a sense of effortfulness. Maybe Pollack was a more than fine director, and he'd already made a semi-ectali of America in his immediately preceding film, the marvelous and perpetually underappreciated They Shoot. Horses, don't they? But something in this film remains just beyond his grip. I think working in such an abstract idiom as the man in the West hobbled his strength for concrete, small-scale human drama, the mode of all his best subsequent films and even several of his weaker efforts. The film strives to be grandly epic, often in some loopy ways at all of 116 minutes in length. The film includes an overture and exit music, as well as an intermission. All of them wild anachronisms in 72 and never exactly typical of Westerns. It's hard to imagine what drove Pollack to include such touches other than an active desire to make his film feel larger than life and special. Somehow it sometimes gets there. In the first 30 minutes it gets there quite easily, and it often returns. Sometimes it feels like the human drama Pollack wants to make in the broad strokes adventure he also wants to make was simply too much across purposes for either to emerge, and in the 1840s Jeremiah Johnson, Robert Redford is a veteran of the Mexican War, who wants to get away from civilization. He sets up an isolated life for himself in the Rocky Mountains and looks to support himself by working as a trapper. At first he struggles, but eventually he gets some much-needed help from a veteran trapped named Chris Lapp. Along the way, Johnson discovers that life in the mountains can be harsh and violent. He adopts a mute boy named Caleb, whose family has been killed by Blackfoot warriors. Later, the chief of the local Flathead tribe gives Jeremiah his daughter. Despite the language barrier between him and his new wife, Jeremiah is soon the head of a happy family. One day, when the U.S. cavalry shows up and requests that Jeremiah guide them through the mountains so that they can rescue some starving missionaries, Jeremiah reluctantly leaves behind his family and helps them. However, Lieutenant Mulvey insists that Jeremiah lead them through as a Cred Crow burial ground. The Crow retaliate by killing Jeremiah's family, driven mad by grief. Jeremiah sets out to kill every Crow that he can find. Jeremiah Johnson is really two movies in one. The story starts out with Jeremiah as a proto-hippie who wants to get away from the hypocrisy and violence of modern society. Jeremiah takes care of the land, makes friends with other outcasts, and makes a good life for himself. After Jeremiah's family is killed, the movie turns into a Death Wish-style revenge thriller with Jeremiah losing himself in his rage and killing almost everyone that he sees. Redford is surprisingly convincing as the insane and murderous Jeremiah and the sudden outbursts of violence provide a strong contrast to the relatively peaceful first half of the film. Jeremiah is like a lot of the early American settlers. He wants to get away from the world and start an entirely new life for himself. He's seen what the civilization has to offer, and he would rather just build a cabin in the mountains and pretend that the rest of the world doesn't exist. If Jeremiah had been born earlier, he probably could have pulled it off, but by the time Jeremiah tries to go off the grid, it's already too late. Society is growing too fast for him to escape from. Jeremiah discovers that it's impossible to truly cut yourself off from humanity. In the end, he's much like the Crow Indians that has declared war upon his way of life is ending, whether he's ready for it or not. When he and the Crow chief greet each other with a raised open hand, meaning that they come in peace, they are both acknowledging that they are bonded as men whose time is coming to an end. Jeremiah Johnson was the second of Robert Redford's many collaborations with director Sidney Pollack, and it's one of their best. This may be an epic film, but it never loses its humanity. And for once, Redford plays someone who isn't a cut-and-dried hero. Jeremiah Johnson has recently been rediscovered because of a popular meme of a bearded Redford looking at the camera and nodding. But people should know that it's also a damn fine film on movie. It feels like Westerns as a category without particularly resembling any one Western I can name, and while it doesn't always perfectly capture the mythic sensibility of that genre, the attempt is bold and impressive. I doubt that anyone unsympathetic to its basic aims would find much outside of maybe Redford's uncharacteristically visual performance to cling to. But as a Western fan of long-standing, I found this one's shortcomings and all to be a fascinating attempt to capture the soul of the form and splash it out for all the world to see. I loved All Is Lost and adore Robert Redford. When I realized that I somehow managed to love Redford and movies about people surviving extreme conditions, yet did not hear about Jeremiah Johnson until rather late in life, I realized it was time to rectify the situation as soon as possible. Everyone seems to agree that it is a classic, and Jeremiah Johnson is one of Redford's favorite movies. Call me a Philistine, but I don't get what all the fuss is about. I will accept your condemnation. If the opening did not already lord him as an amazing man and a legend in the narration, or was it a song, perhaps I would have been less annoyed if his status as a mixture of myth, legend, and fact were in an opening title. I would have lowered my expectations off the titular character and expected that Jeremiah Johnson was the story of him becoming a legend instead of being incredibly inept and mostly having a sitcom feel of comical misunderstandings with huge implications that work out happenstance and wacky affable characters. For a guy who wants to be alone in the wilderness, he keeps lucking into survival internships, friendships, and relationships. To fair, the film begins with the implication that Jeremiah Johnson is running away from something terrible, specifically war, and there is always a sense of foreboding that things can go mortally wrong instantly. Jeremiah Johnson avoids conflict even when it appears culturally appropriate for the period to so. Indeed, there is an abrupt tonal shift towards the end of Jeremiah Johnson. Perhaps Jeremiah Johnson was tapping into that zeitgeist of disillusionment over the Vietnam War. Then Jeremiah Johnson becomes the impossible white man and reveals that Jeremiah Johnson is an alias. Jeremiah Johnson is actually John Wick Sr., who loses his crap over way more than a puppy. Jeremiah Johnson earns the vengeance twist in comparison to the Revenant. The end? Apparently the real life Jeremiah Johnson was less likable. Hint, he could eat liver with fave beans and a nice Chianti. Yikes. Jeremiah Johnson is a dated, sanitized, though probably daring for its time survivalist tale. Jeremiah Johnson did nothing for me. And the abrupt tonal shifts took me out of the story. But everyone loves it, so don't listen to me. If you love Robert Redford and tales of survival in the wilderness, give it a chance. But don't say that I didn't warn you. I would be curious how Native Americans felt about Jeremiah Johnson when it hit theaters. Extra information. He rewritten Italian. Release title of Jeremiah Johnson, Red Crow, You Will Not Have My Scalp, says more about what Sidney Pollack's 1972 revisionist naturalist Western isn't then what it is at this time. Robert Redford's uneasy relationship with his stud reputation was blossoming into full-on activist mode, and no director enabled the restructuring of the Redford brand from twinkle-eyed poster boy into wounded earthy radical better than Pollack. Only Michael Richis, the candidate, interrogated Redford as a more than plausible empty suit who only begins to develop an authentic political consciousness after he's been transformed into a billboard already. Pollack's collaborations with the star, especially Jeremiah Johnson and 3 Days of the Condors, ped viewer and hero alike through ideological conundrums that would add it up to a rich understanding of the complexities of American history and its attendant guilt, but not without a fair amount of entitled fist-shaking when all was said and done. Intriguingly, Jeremiah Johnson turns the aforementioned redemption zega on its tracing Johnson's evolution from this film mountain man to Indian. Integrated peace. Back to bloodthirsty trapper, leaving him with more questions than answers. Johnson is a tight-lipped deserter from the Mexican War, fed up with humanity, looking to eke out a solitary life for himself in the Colorado Rockies, painted in the folksy naturalism of many a mood music album cover from the period. Redford apparently convinced Pollack to shoot on location in Utah, and the struggle between letting the canned dramedy influence the locations, and not vice versa, is palpable throughout the film. The film's sparse gruffs of dialogue overflow with subtext, as does the opening number by Tim McIntyre, who sweetly lifts that a story doesn't always go, or the way you had in chief paints his shirt red. Johnson is found by a colorful crank named Bearclaw Lapp, who in a bit of foreshadowing lives as though he were a Blackfoot himself, and initiates Johnson's long, torturous education in the ways of the mountain man. Calling him Pilgrim, Lapp scolds Johnson for longing after female company. He insists that a woman's breast is the hardest rock the Almighty ever made on this earth, but lest viewers begin to despair that they'll never see Redford shirtless again. He comes across a cabin that's been marauded by Blackfeet, including a mute young boy and his raving mad mother. The only survivors, Johnson adopts the boy. The mother dissolves like many characters into the landscape that surrounds Johnson, but never touches him again. Whether this episodic blurring of narrative and symbolic strokes was intentional on the part of Pollack or just badly scripted by John Milius and Edward on Alt is hard to figure, but it's an interesting feature and a bellwether of the film's ambitions to be a proper Western without a sustained narrative arc. Johnson and the boy meet another gregarious trapper named Goo, whose feelings about Indians aren't anywhere near as gentile as Lapp's. The two fight off a Blackfoot ambush, and Pollack tries his hand at editing for action, often re-choreographing the same tumbles, kicks, punches, and gunfire for different angles, and then cutting aggressively between them as closer response in montage to Peck Emperor's so-coletic emphasis on juxtaposing slow and regular speed, as is visible in studio-made revisionist westerns. Goosen and the boy are intercepted by a different tribe, this time God-fearing flatheads who hate the Blackfeet almost as much as Gudo's Johnson nobly attempts to turn the page by offering them the scalps and horses from the prior battle, but offends the chief into one-upping his generosity with a gift of his own, his comely daughter Swan. And so Johnson, the mute boy, and Swan set out to live again peacefully, making a log cabin from scratch, pelting bears to keep warm. These domestic scenes comprise the film's midsection and their politics if area awfully creaky. Once Swan and Johnson start actually having sex, here Elijah's beard has been scratching her face. The quivering wind section that greets Redford shaven seems designed to signal a turning point in their understanding of each other. A cavalry shows up near Johnson's home in missionary wagon. Head vises the Megaints passing through as a Cred Crow burial ground. They do anyway, and Johnson returns from a hunting trip to find both Swan and the mute boy killed. Soit goes suffering on account of his attempt to work with his surroundings rather than against them. Johnson treks out in solitude, again regrowing his beard and of course killing more Indians. Whenever Redford and the natives engage in battle, the blocking and rhythm of the scene stakes on an almost feral quality, with the director so emphatic on pushing their brutality that they become more brutal but less realistic. During quiet moments, Johnson stares into the distance with a hard glint in his eye. Statuesque, Pollack's design is log-jammed between the relatively humorless widescreen Technicolor panoramas of yesteryear and the soft-focused telephoto explorations of the time, whereas Robert Allman and Vilmo Zsigmond managed in McCabe and Mrs. Miller to enshroud their characters among blankets of snow and pine trees as optical vespers uneasy blots moving across landscapes. Pollack and his cinematographer tend to stick with regular wide and medium shots, especially for dialogue scenes, with giant mountainsides shoved in the background. That's Jeremiah Johnson to A.T. Sandwiched between mood and character, with no real definitive linkage of either an oddly straight-laced attempt to conjure a miracle from prime ingredients with plenty of care, but no real thought to their arrangement. The intent seems to be Robert Redford plus beard plus fiddle music plus pine trees equals Thoreau. Redford reportedly was a bearer at the 1972 reburial of the real Johnson in Cody, Wyoming. It is especially messianic type of Hollywood film that allows its leading man to be both hero and victim. This film, directed by Sidney Pollack, screenplay by Edward Arnold, John Milius, story by Raymond W. Thorp, Robert Bunker, produced by Joe Wizan, starring Robert Redford, Will Geer. Allyn and McLerie, Stefan, Gierasch. Charles Tyner, Del Bolton, cinematography, Duke Callahan. Edited by Thomas Sanford. Music by Tim McIntyre, John Rubenstein. Production company, Sanford Productions. Distributed by Warner Brothers. Release dates May 7, 1972 in Cannes, December 21, 1972 in New York City. Running time 18 minutes, 116 minutes. Country, United States. Languages, English, Crow, Salish. Budget, $3.1 million. Box office, $44.7 million. So guys, this is the review of Jeremiah Johnson movie and some information about it. How do you like our today's video? Please let us know by commenting, and if you like this video, please like it, share it, and don't forget to subscribe West Films to our channel. Thanks for watching.